Thank you for joining us for this quarter's Compliance Bootcamp webinar, ACA Repeal and Replace, Progress in the First 100 Days. The presentation slides will be emailed to all participants by tomorrow. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see several widgets for your use during the presentation. For example, if you have a question, please click the purple Q&A icon to the left. At the end of the session, the yellow certification icon on the right will become active for you to download your SHRM and HRCI credits. Speaking today is Dan Cooperstein, Senior Vice President of Compliance at Corporate Synergies. Corporate Synergies is a national insurance and employee benefits brokerage and consultancy, where Dan is a respected thought leader on healthcare reform. He has published many articles and videos on the Affordable Care Act and other laws and regulations, which can be found in the Knowledge Center at corpsyn.com. Dan is an ERISA attorney with experience in a broad array of sophisticated employee benefits and labor and employment matters, including the ACA, COBRA, HIPAA, and GINA compliance. At this time, I will turn it over to Dan.
Thanks, Ashley, and welcome to today's webinar, ACA Repeal and Replace, Progress in the First 100 Days, where we're going to look at what happened to President Trump's Repeal and Replace initiative in the first 100 days of his presidency. And as I'm sure most of you are aware, President Trump had promised on the campaign trail that one of his first presidential initiatives would be the repeal and replacement of the Affordable Care Act. And now, 100 days in, we're going to take a closer look at what happened to that repeal and replace initiative, what's next for that initiative, and what employers and plan sponsors need to be doing today to stay in compliance with the ACA in 2017, 2018, and beyond. So we're going to start off by looking at some really recent events that have happened in the Repeal and Replace initiative. We're going to understand the three prongs of the Repeal and Replace initiative, and then we're going to focus in on the American Health Care Act, which was the withdrawn ACA replacement plan that did not go to a vote at the end of March. We're going to focus in on that. We're going to call that the rewire of the ACA. And then we're going to look at what went wrong and try to figure out what happened, why it didn't work at the end of March. And then we'll look at what's going to be next for Repeal and Replace as we go into the weeks and months ahead. And then we're going to take a look in Section 2 of the presentation about what we still have to do for the ACA, what's still required. It's still the law of the land, so we're going to take a look at what that requires. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how we predict the ACA is going to be changing under the Trump administration, some of its challenges to its survival. We're going to take a look at some provisions that are probably going to be dead. And we're going to provide some key takeaways for employers and plan sponsors so they can be prepared to continue to comply with the ACA as we go forward. So, and then we'll finish with some other important benefits compliance developments that, really important things to understand that are happening from HIPAA all across the board, IRS developments, DOL developments, and other things. And before we get started, I have a couple of disclaimers. I am an attorney. Attorneys love disclaimers. So I have a couple of quick disclaimers. The first one being that at Corporate Synergies, we do not take any political positions. Our main goal is to help make it easier for you to understand developments that impact the compliance of your health and welfare plans and other insurance arrangements. So, when we refer to Trump Care, it's not meant to be disrespectful or derogatory in any way. It's just really a shorthand reference to the health care policies that have been proposed by the President Donald Trump that he wants to see get effectuated. So, again, no political positions here at CSG. And then secondly, as I'm sure you're all aware, events impacting healthcare compliance are changing very, very quickly. We finalized the presentation slides very recently, and already things have changed. So things are probably going to be changing while I'm speaking. So I guess my second disclaimer is kind of like a disclaimer that's also kind of mixed with a plug, which is that if you want to see what's happening right now, taking into account the fact that things I'm saying today could be different tomorrow, even though everything I'm saying today is correct as of now, it's just changing so quickly that we would definitely recommend you check out our ACA Now webpage on corpsyn.com, which has the latest breaking news and updates, including things that are happening as I speak right now with the changes to the White House's proposed changes to the tax code, So definitely take a look at that. Okay, so now that the disclaimers are done, let's go ahead and get started and take a look at the Repeal and Replace initiative. What went wrong? What happened? And before we do that, I think it's always a good, it's good to take a second and just look at this time period, right? 100 days. What does that mean? Presidents since the time of Franklin Roosevelt have tried to get many of their big policy and legislative achievements done in the first 100 days. It doesn't always work out. Here you see a picture of House Speaker Paul Ryan looking a little disappointed because it didn't work out at the end of March, repeal and replace. And we're going to look at that. We're going to look at why that happened, how it happened. But before we do that, let's take a look at kind of the timeline of the developments, some of the most important developments in the repeal and replace effort that have happened really since the beginning of the year. The first thing that happened was that on January 12th and 13, the U.S. House of Representatives and Senate approved a budget resolution that would allow for the ACA to be amended through a process called budget reconciliation. And I'm just going to briefly kind of just mention what is budget reconciliation. Well, it's a process that allows legislation to go through Congress with a simple majority vote. So, for example, in the House, they would only need 216 votes, 51 in the Senate, and there's pluses and minuses for the Republican lawmakers with this repeal effort. The burden, well, let's start with the benefit. The benefit, of course, is that benefit I just mentioned, which is that you'll need a simple majority. But the burden, the downside is that any law that's passed through budget reconciliation has to be limited to budgetary aspects of the ACA. So, for example, it can eliminate tax penalties, but it can't create a new provision that makes it easier to buy insurance across state lines. So, it's an important thing to take into account when we talk about the rewire of the ACA and the repeal effort. On January 20th, the President signed an executive order weakening enforcement of the ACA. We're going to talk more about that in just a little bit. On February 14th, the IRS indicated that it may be weakening the enforcement of the ACA's individual mandate. And then just a day later, in an effort to calm down fears of insurers, on February 15th, the Department of Health and Human Services proposed regulations designed to stabilize the exchanges, make it a little harder for people to game the system on the exchanges, and we'll talk about that. And then on February 24th, there was a leaked ACA replacement plan that was leaked on Politico that included a cap on the employer tax exclusion for health insurance coverage, much to the fear of many employers across the country, which fortunately was not included in the final version of the ACA replacement plan, which came out on March 6th of 2017, which was the American Health Care Act, or AHCA, which we'll be referring to throughout this presentation as the AHCA, or the rewire of the ACA. And that was unveiled March 6th, and really we're going to go into a lot of detail on that later, so I'm not going to talk about that now. But then we saw on March 13th an interesting thing happen. The Department of Health and Human Services released a letter that encouraged states to apply for what are called state innovation waivers, which are essentially these are waivers that are permitted under Section 1332 of the ACA that allow states to propose an innovative approach to their state health care structure that would provide access for high-quality, affordable health insurance without raising the federal deficit. And if such a waiver proposal is granted by HHS, then the waivers would allow the states to be exempt from certain ACA mandates and requirements. So as an example of an innovative thing that happened that was given on the HHS website, Alaska, for example, created a very innovative state-operated reinsurance program that significantly offset premium increases that were slated for 2017. So very interesting developments that we're watching very closely. On March 24th, the AHCA, which is the ACA's rewire or replacement plan, was withdrawn without a vote, and that was, of course, created those sad looks you saw earlier from Paul Ryan. On March 29th, we saw HHS Secretary Tom Price testify before the House, explaining ways that the ACA may be enforced differently in the future. And really there, he didn't really give us that many details, but just said that from his viewpoint, the ACA has caused a lot of harm, and they would like to enforce it in a way that will increase access to coverage and lower the cost of coverage. But he didn't really give us a lot of details, but it is an interesting development. And then throughout March and April, we saw President Trump and Republican lawmakers vow to continue the Repeal and Replace initiative that failed on March 24th. And then on April 12th, President Trump threatened to withhold CSR payments to insurers to press Democrats to work with him on the replacement bill. And first of all, what are CSR payments? Well, these are cost-sharing reduction subsidy payments that are owed to insurers that have made coverage obtained on exchanges more affordable for low-income individuals. They're specifically they reimburse the insurers for providing discounted deductibles for low-income ACA exchange enrollees. And during the Obama administration, Republican lawmakers in Congress had sued the Obama administration, alleging that the payments were unlawful since they were not approved by Congress. And a federal judge in 2016 had ruled that the payments were improper, but let the payments continue while the Obama administration pursued an appeal. And then after President Trump's election, Republican lawmakers requested and received a delay in the case. So it's one of those things that's still hanging in the balance. But of course, if CSR payments are canceled, insurers have warned that they could pull out of the exchanges because of the large hole that's left in their budgets, which of course could create very great chaos on the exchanges. And then on April 18th, we saw final HHS exchange stabilization regulations, which we'll talk about in a little more detail in just a little bit. And then on April 20th, which was just this last Thursday, House Republicans restarted discussions on a revamped ACA that would give the states the ability to waive certain ACA mandates. And even more recently, very late last night, we saw an actual draft version of that amendment was leaked. So I will be discussing that. I'll be speaking to that later in today's presentation. So a lot of things happened recently, and they continue to happen pretty much every day. So we'll keep you updated. But let's kind of talk about how all this started, right? It started the day, really the day that the president signed an executive order, the day he was sworn into office, giving his mission statement for what he would like to see happen with the ACA, which was a prompt repeal of the ACA, plus he wanted to give agencies the discretion to grant waivers, exemptions, and delays to reduce the costs and the fiscal burdens that the ACA has imposed. Now, the interesting thing about the executive order was that, as you can see in Section 5, the agencies still have to comply with the law. So even though they are allowed to use some discretion in how they enforce the ACA, at the end of the day, they still have to comply with the Administrative Procedures Act and follow the requirements of the law. Now, one thing that's very interesting when we're talking about the enforcing the ACA happened on February 14th, which was that there were IRS officials were quoted in Reason.com as stating that the IRS will not require individuals to disclose whether they had health insurance coverage in 2016 in order to accept and process their individual tax returns. So, for example, you would not have to complete line 61 on Form 1040, and you would still be able to get a processed tax return. While that seemed to indicate that the IRS was not enforcing the individual mandate, all other indications that we're aware of suggest that they are still enforcing the individual mandate, just that they'll accept and process the tax return without that being filled out. But it was an interesting development that we will continue to monitor. And then very recently, on April 18th, we got the final regulation to stabilize the exchanges. And then, while many of these rules really were designed to calm the fears of insurers and don't really directly impact employers, they do have sort of an indirect impact on employers, which is that since these rules make it harder for individuals to qualify for exchange coverage, they can reduce the possibility that the employer will be assessed a pay or play penalty under the ACA's employer shared responsibility provisions, because those penalties only go into effect if one of your employees, if you're an employer and one of your employees goes on to the exchange, that's sort of the trigger or the catalyst for those penalties. So in some ways, this could be a good thing, but it does impose a pretty big burden on individuals because they have to show, for example, more supporting documentation to qualify for a special enrollment period on the exchanges. It shortens the open enrollment period for the exchanges. It's really designed to prevent individuals from really gaming the system. And so those are some of the developments that have been happening, but we wanted to talk about kind of the bigger vision. I mean, this is something that we think is really important. Throughout the process of the Repeal and Replace initiative, you may have read articles in the Wall Street Journal, of the New York Times about the bigger vision, the three-prong vision. Well, what is that three-prong approach? Well, in short, the Republicans said that we imagine getting rid of the ACA in three big steps. First, we do the budget reconciliation process, which is what I just discussed earlier, which is that, pass it through budgetary legislation. All we need is a simple majority in the House and Senate. That should be the easy part, which is what we've seen with the AHCA. And then the second part is regulatory and administrative changes. And there the burden really shifts to the agencies, right? The Department of Health and Human Services, IRS, where we're going to see them really work together and enforce the law in new ways that makes it easier for business owners and for individuals. And then the third part is more legislation. This would be the passage of new substantive legislation through the Senate and the House. And the interesting part is that they would need Democratic support. They need at least 8 votes, for example, to get 60 votes in the Senate, because they would not be able to do that through budget reconciliation. And that would include things like, a rule to make it easier to buy insurance across state lines, things like that. So what we did is, just to kind of encapsulate a lot of the bigger vision, we noticed that a lot of the different proposals that were very popular by Republicans were really, in many ways, encapsulated into President Trump's campaign promises on the campaign trail. So we took those and we put them into a chart that you can download called the Bigger Vision for ACA Repeal and Replace, and it just kind of goes through those items that the president wanted to do and kind of what we think the impact will be both on the ACA and employers going forward. And so, for example, one of those things that could not have that was proposed by President Trump was greater provider price transparency. So he wanted to see healthcare providers have more price transparency to allow individuals to make it easier for them to shop around for effective care. There was nothing like that in the ACA. Since that's a substantive provision, there was nothing that you could do in the AHCA on that. But we'll keep watching things like that as things develop. So it's an interesting chart for you to download. But we also wanted to take a look, before we go into the AHCA, we just thought it would be nice to take a kind of a brief look at some of the different approaches that were out there, and very, very different approaches. And I think that's part of the reason why there was so much disagreement among Republicans when it came to coming to a vote on March 24th. But you can see that there were 5 main plans that came forward. The 5 leading plans were the Tom Price plan, which we'll talk about. The Paul Ryan plan came out in 2016, A Better Way. We'll talk about that as well. Those 2 were really kind of the big influences on the AHCA, and we'll see how those things kind of work their way in. But there were several others planned by Bill Cassidy, Orrin Hatch, and Rand Paul. And of course, interestingly about Rand Paul is that in his view, the AHCA did not go far enough, right? It was not enough of a real replacement. It was just sort of ACA, ACA light, or ACA, more conservative ACA. So in any event, let's kind of go in a little bit and see what some of these big plans look like. The Tom Price plan, called the Empowering Patients First Act, was really, you can see a lot of that in what the final proposal was. He had this idea for a flat, refundable, age-adjusted tax credit, which the final version looked a lot like that. that essentially you get a refundable. If you don't have coverage from your employer, you can qualify for this governmental credit. It's not as closely tied. It's more static than what you see under the ACA, so it's not as closely tied to income. And you could use that for purchasing coverage in the individual market. There were some other interesting things. He had an employer exclusion on the tax credit for healthcare coverage for up to $20,000. There were some interesting provisions about limiting state restrictions on auto enrollment, allowing for small businesses to get certain grants. He also had a provision that would have allowed for insurers to report claim information to plans. So it was an interesting proposal that kind of worked its way into the AHCA. We also saw a lot of the Paul Ryan plan in the AHCA. He also had a very, almost the same concept of this portable refundable tax credit. Again, more static than what you saw with the ACA. He also wanted there to be greater flexibility with HSAs so that you could transfer funds to and from HSAs. When this Better Way came out, he also wanted to make it easier for small businesses to have access to HRAs. A lot of what we saw in the Cures Act came from this, so he already kind of won on the HRA front when we saw that legislation go through in December of 2016, but he wants to see more with HSAs. There's a big push for consumer-driven healthcare in a lot of these proposals, and that's what we're going to be talking about actually in our next quarterly webinar, so definitely come join us for that, where we're going to focus in on those types of plans. And then he also wanted to eliminate the Cadillac tax, also put a cap on the employer tax exclusion for health insurance coverage, and make it easier to purchase insurance across state lines. He also, like the ACA, wanted to protect patients with pre-existing conditions and put a cap on Medicaid funds, among other changes. So a lot of that you can see in the Rewire. So let's talk about the Rewire, the American Health Care Act, and get a better understanding of what this is. This was the one that got, of course, withdrawn in March. And it's really, I think the most interesting thing about this, when you take a look at this, is that it's not really a replacement. It's really just an amendment to the ACA. So it still contains approximately 70% of the ACA. It just took out a lot of the things that were very unpopular, like the employer mandate, the individual mandate, a lot of things that people just didn't like. So I think this image is really appropriate as, it's a rewire of the ACA. And rather than giving you sort of a list of, here's everything that's in it, and of course I think that would make a very boring slide, we decided just to kind of take, make a chart that brings up the most important ACA provisions to employers, combined with the most important policy goals of Republican lawmakers with an ACA replacement plan, and then went through and looked at, whether or not it was in the AHCA and how such a provision would fare, going forward. So it's kind of a more interesting take on this. Now, one thing that was talked about in the AHCA was the Cadillac tax. This was the Cadillac tax is a tax to a 40% excise tax on high-cost insurance coverage. The AHCA, rather than repealing it, actually extended it until 2026. And even if the AHCA never passes, and I know it's currently still in deliberations and discussions and debate, but even if it doesn't pass, our view is that this is probably going to die before 2026 because there's just such strong bipartisan support to repeal the Cadillac tax. The other thing, of course, that was retained in the AHCA was the dependent coverage to age 26. That was something that President Trump had said he liked about the Affordable Care Act. And the AHCA also repeals the employer tax for not offering affordable, adequate coverage to full-time employees, the employer shared responsibility tax. We quickly just refer to that as the pay or play or the employer mandate. Now, interestingly, it doesn't necessarily get rid of the mandate, it just gets rid of the tax, so because it's a budget reconciliation law. Also, and it would have gotten rid of it beginning in 2016, I should mention that as well. Now, the interesting thing about ACA information reporting, this I think actually is probably the most common question that we get is, well, would the AHCA get rid of ACA information reporting? Because HR folks that's probably their biggest dislike when it comes to the ACA. And unfortunately, it does not get rid of ACA information reporting, but if you're getting rid of the employer mandate, and we'll talk about later, they're getting rid of the individual mandate as we know them, then there really is no need for this current system that we have of ACA information reporting with 1094Cs and 1095Cs. Now, that would depend on the AHCA passing and becoming law. But even if the AHCA does become law, it will still require a new type of reporting because there's two provisions that in the AHCA that will require reporting. The first is the lapse in coverage tax, which we'll talk about briefly. Essentially, the government needs to determine if there was a lapse in coverage to increase taxes on those who had the lapse. And for purposes of the refundable tax credits, those tax credits are only given for a particular month if the individual is not eligible for other specified coverage, which is defined as a group health plan coverage. So we still probably will see something like reporting, not as detailed as what we have now, if this becomes law. Now, there was one of the bigger vision proposals was the foreign drug trade. There was a proposal to lower costs and increase consumerism by opening up the drug market to foreign competition. And that, of course, was not included in the AHCA, but it is a part of that larger, that bigger ACA vision for the repeal and replace effort. There was also a big push to make it easier to purchase health insurance across state lines. Now, there already was something in the ACA about that. The Republicans wanted to do something to make it even easier than what was in the ACA, but that could not be proposed at this first stage of budget reconciliation. And was not included in the AHCA. Now, we did see that the ACA's increased Medicare tax on high earners was repealed by the AHCA bill. Also, in the White House briefing that came out about an hour ago, they mentioned that they would also repeal this tax as part of their the White House tax proposal. So that's an extremely unpopular tax. Even if the AHCA were not to happen, we could see that get repealed through tax reform. The individual mandate in the AHCA is replaced by this lapse in coverage requirement. And what that is that if somebody has a lapse in coverage of at least 63 days, then they will face a 30% premium tax over a 12-month period going forward. It's kind of a way to replace that individual mandate and also appease the concerns of insurers. The Medicaid expansion part of the AHCA is probably, now it's a part, we're not going to spend a lot of time on that today because it doesn't impact employers, but that was probably one of the most unpopular parts of the AHCA, probably one of the big reasons why it was not liked by moderate Republicans. That part would have changed Medicaid to a per capita system with an option to allow states to choose a block grant rather than a per capita cap to fund their adult and children populations. Additionally, the AHCA would have allowed states to impose a work requirement on certain individuals with obviously with certain exceptions for the elderly, disabled, but that probably made it even more unpopular with the moderates, and that's one of the things that we'll talk about a little bit more briefly, but we're not going to go into a lot of detail on. Also, the AHCA would have repealed the medical device tax. The no-cost preventive services would have still been in there without changes. There was nothing in the AHCA about non-discrimination requirements. If you remember from our earlier presentations, we talked a lot about this. The ACA would have, if regulations had ever been drafted by the Treasury, the ACA would have required that fully insured health plans not discriminate in favor of highly compensated employees. Never happened under Obama, and unlikely to happen with this Treasury, which is much more pro-employer, so probably a dead provision there of the ACA. There was also now with regard to pre-existing condition, that was retained in the AHCA. Now more recently, last night, based on the amendment that happened, there is some language in there that kind of allows states to have a waiver, for somewhat from that. We'll talk about that later. The premium subsidies on the exchanges are being replaced by this age-based refundable tax credit. I know we haven't talked a lot about that yet. We just looked at the proposal from Tom Price, but the AHCA proposed to give tax credits of between $2,000 to $4,000 per year, with a cap of $14,000 per family. That would vary by age. So, for example, if you're under 30, the tax credit would be $2,000. 60 years old or older, $4,000. And then the tax credit would begin phasing out at $75,000 for singles, $150,000 for families, and then you would not be able to get a credit if you were eligible for other specified coverage, like a group health plan. So that's kind of how that worked. And of course, like I said before, not as closely tied to income as those premium subsidies under the ACA. And we're going to do a little bit of a side-by-side comparison later, so you'll get to see kind of what that looks like in reality for some people out there. Here's some other provisions that, we're not going to go into a lot of detail on these, but, you can see there was a lot of things that that were, really different from the ACA in this. One thing that was new that a lot of employers really liked about the ACA was that that the bill nearly doubled the amount of money that individuals could contribute to HSA accounts and broaden the ways that they could be used. So it actually would cover the deductible of the high deductible health plan. That was something, of course, that we'll talk a lot more about in our next webinar, but a very popular provision. And there was a part of the ACA, there were these opt-out arrangement rules that would have required non-compliant opt-out arrangements, the value of those opt-out payments in the non-compliant arrangements to be added to the cost of coverage for determining the affordability of that coverage. Very unpopular, difficult, burdensome tax regulation that was proposed under the Obama administration in the summer. Never finalized. It was delayed in December of 2016. I think it's very unlikely with the current Treasury that we'll ever see that again. So that was not in the AHCA, probably will not be seen again. Okay, so why did the AHCA fail? Why was this thing so unpopular? And why did it fail and not go to a vote on March 24th? Well, first of all, the people on the far right, the right-wing Freedom Caucus, they didn't like it. In their view, it didn't do enough to eliminate the ACA. You talked about 70% of the ACA was still in there, right? They didn't like the new refundable tax credit system. They thought that was too much like the ACA's premium subsidies. And then on the other side of the Republican, on the other side of the House, the moderate conservatives in the House didn't like it because the cuts to Medicaid went way too far. And we have a chart that shows that, well, we'll just look at it in just a minute, but the Medicaid affects more than 50% of people know someone in the U.S. that were polled by this poll know someone that's affected by Medicaid. There was a concern that too many individuals in their states would lose coverage, and we're going to take a look at that CBO data in just a minute. And they didn't like the new refundable tax credit system, and we'll give you an example of I think why that was so unpopular in just a minute. So let's start with Medicaid. This chart, which was released by the Kaiser Family Foundation Health Tracking Poll, of those polled, over half reported at least some connection to Medicaid. You can see that it's more than 50%. Maybe they knew a friend or a family member covered by it. Maybe they had a child covered by Medicaid. So Medicaid is extremely popular. This would have put essentially a cap and restrictions on Medicaid that were very unpopular. When we look at the CBO data, that was another big thing that really, I think, raised eyebrows by moderate Republicans in the House. When you're looking at the CBO, what the impact would be in 2026, you can see that they estimated that 24 million people would lose coverage under the AHCA. So that's a really tough thing to go back to your constituency with, regardless of your political, regardless of your politics, I think. And obviously, we don't take any political position. I think there we go. And this third one, I think, is probably the most revealing of the charts that we have on this as to why the HCA was so unpopular. And if you look at, if you take a closer look at this Kaiser chart, which interestingly came out right after the American Health Care Act was proposed, so they worked on this right away. Looking at 2020 federal poverty limits and income from of an age 60-year-old, if you look at the third row down, a 60-year-old living in Mobile, Alabama, making $20,000 would receive a Affordable Care Act premium tax credit of $13,235, whereas under the American Health Care Act, that same person would 60-year-old would get a tax credit of $4,000. So, obviously, while we don't take any political positions here at Corporate Synergies, obviously a politician in Mobile, Alabama, of any stripe is going to have at least some difficulty taking this plan back to his constituency when he has to tell us, the 60-year-olds that their premium tax credit is going to be going down by about $9,000 a year. So that all of these things, I think these last three charts kind of give you an idea of really why this was so unpopular and why it didn't work out, particularly with the moderates. And you can even see this is another Kaiser Family Foundation health tracking poll where you see that the Democrats and independents both thought it was a good thing that the AHCA did not pass. And then when you look at the Republicans, it was still relatively close. 54% said it was a bad thing, 39% said it was a good thing. So, even among Republicans, there was not like this overwhelming, interest in seeing this thing pass. Okay, so what's next? What's coming up? I mean, what's happening now, and what's coming up with the Repeal and the Replace initiative and effort? Well, right after March 24th, when it was clear to see that the bill wasn't going to work, there was a lot of talk about a second bill coming out that would be better, and that would be better than the first bill. But the problem was that the moderate conservatives were just not on board with that, and there was a lot of doubt as to whether or not something would pass in the Senate. But then we saw the president continue to urge throughout April, saying, hey, we're going to do this. We're still working on it. On April 2nd of 2017, the president tweeted that talks are continuing, and we will continue until such time as a deal is hopefully struck. So the president has been a continued cheerleader till the present on seeing something happen. And then on April 20th, we saw the right-wing and moderate House come together a little bit. That was Thursday over the MacArthur amendment to the AHCA. And this summary that we have here is the summary of the amendment that came out on April 20th. But this was actually, we got a lot more detail actually on this last night, April 25th. So I'm going to kind of speak a little bit to that. But essentially, what it would do is the MacArthur amendment would reinstate EHBs as the federal standard. And when we say that, there was this proposal, a last-minute amendment to the AHCA that said that states would have the ability, with respect to the allocation of premium tax credits, to redefine the EHBs within their state for a 2-year period from 2018 through 2019. It wasn't necessarily clear what that really meant. This essentially says, no, we're going to make EHBs a federal standard now, but we will grant these limited state waivers. And we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. And then the other part of the MacArthur amendment would just say that it would retain several of the provisions that were in the AHCA. So, for example, the prohibition on denying coverage due to pre-existing conditions, the prohibition on gender discrimination, guaranteed issue of coverage, age 26 dependent coverage. Those things in the AHCA would still be there, including community rating rules. And actually, the AHCA had a 5-to-1 age rating ratio, which replaced the 3-to-1 age rating ratio of the ACA. So a little bit different, but it would allow for an exception for limited state waivers. And then the amendment would give these states the ability to get a waiver if they did certain things. So you could get a waiver for the EHBs and the community rating rules, but you had to attest that the purpose of it was to reduce premium costs, increase the number of covered persons, or advance some other benefit that was of public interest to the state. Now, more recently, what happened last night that was so interesting is that we got a lot more clarity. We got a leaked version on Politico last night of the provisions, what it would actually look like in legislative draft form. And we got a lot more clarity on it. It clarified that the very unusual language that we saw about EHBs was, it clarified what that meant essentially, which was that the amendment is going to allow states now to apply for waivers to EHBs, not that they could have discretion to change EHPs for that limited 2-year period. So it was a clarification. And then it said that there would be 3 different types of waivers available. First, states could apply for plan years beginning on or after January 1st of 2018 to set an age ratio higher than the 5-to-1 ratio established by the AHCA. So that's very interesting, but it was not clear from the language of the leaked draft if that meant the 5-to-1 ratio or the 3-to-1 ratio under the ACA. The second type of waiver would allow states to beginning after January 1 of 2020 to specify their own set of essential health benefits for all purposes in the individual and small group markets. And of course, that would be very big. It could allow, for example, states to define what categories of benefits would have to be covered by insurers. For example, the kinds of drugs that would have to be offered. And the third type of waiver would allow states to permit insurers to engage in health status underwriting, but only under certain conditions. And first of all, they'd have to obtain a waiver. In order to obtain the waiver, they'd have to indicate that the state was willing to provide financial assistance to help high-risk individuals to get coverage in the individual market, and or they'd have to create one of these what are essentially reinsurance programs. And even though there's a provision in that third waiver language of the amendment that says nothing in this act shall be construed as permitting insurers to limit access to health coverage for individuals with pre-existing conditions, that's pretty much what health status underwriting does. So it's a little confusing as to what that third waiver really means, and we'll continue to be watching that very closely. Okay, so what do you have to do, right? We have the Affordable Care Act. It's still the law of the land. We've been talking about this a lot in our last 2 webinars, so we're not going to go into a lot of detail about what you need to do. But you can see here from 2017 through 2020, this is what's still on the books, right? Beginning on April 1, for plan years beginning on April 1 of 2017 and thereafter, there's a new SBC format requirement that you need to have in place. And also there's these new grandfathered plan rules that went into effect in 2017. We call them grandfathered plan rules, but they apply to rescission of coverage, out-of-network versus in-network rules that primarily the insurance carriers have already put into effect. And then we were expecting to see final opt-out rules go into effect in 2017. That has not happened yet. There were supposed to be new Form 5500 requirements under ERISA that affected ACA reporting that were going to go into effect in 2019. I think it's pretty unlikely that's going to happen now. And of course, 2020 Cadillac tax still on the books. And then you see the big green arrow on the right. We think it's pretty unlikely that, as we talked about earlier, that non-discrimination testing for fully insured plans will ever happen. So it's kind of the big picture, the big roadmap. But we have this slide in there just as sort of a reminder. In fact, the IRS just recently updated their website to indicate to add this information, to update their website for this information, which shows that the 2017 penalties are still in effect. So, you're still required in 2017 to offer coverage to at least 95% of your full-time employees and their dependents, and that coverage has to meet those ACA mandates of, affordable coverage, minimum value, and MEC. So, still the law of the land. But how is the ACA going to be evolving, and what do we expect under the Trump administration? We talked earlier about how we think things are going to be really changing. Really, it's going to be an enforcement change, right? So, they can't change the law if they can't get something like the AHCA passed. Then the law won't change. So what they'll have to do is really on the enforcement side. One thing that they could do is they could stop enforcing the individual mandate, which would mean that, of course, healthy people would leave the exchanges because there'd be really no incentive to have coverage. And of course, that could lead to a death spiral when insurers pull out, things like that. They may not enforce all of the regulations that were proposed during the Obama administration. We've talked about a couple of those, the non-discrimination rules, the opt-out rules. So that's another thing that could happen. They may not enforce the premium tax credit distribution rules, because we've already seen that they're changing the enforcement of some of the exchange. They created these new exchange rules that change how they're enforcing the exchanges. They could also do similar things to premium tax credit distribution that could see make it harder for individuals to get those premium tax credits. Of course, that would have a benefit for employers because it would lead to lower penalties. The HHS will also probably likely promote ACA rules that give states greater authority to waive or water down rules. We saw that with state innovation waivers. So what are some of our predictions? We put some of them onto this chart called the ACA Walking Dead. And this chart that we have available for download is really limited to those things. We've already talked about several of them that are in the ACA now, but they're really probably not going to ever happen. So definitely check out that, download the chart. I think you'll find it very interesting. Okay, so what are the big challenges to the survival of the ACA? And I think the big one really, I think that's the most concerning to the insurers is will the HHS under the Trump administration and the IRS really enforce this individual mandate? Because, I think that, and plus, making more difficult exchange qualification requirements, all of these things, may create less incentives to obtain exchange coverage for individuals. Now, the first part of that could, of course, lead to all the healthy people getting off the exchanges, which could lead to the death spiral. With only sick people on them, insurers pull out. But also, if it's really difficult to get exchange coverage, then less people gain the system, so it kind of balances things out a little bit. It's hard to see. I mean, that's kind of, those two things are kind of the things that I think are the biggest concern. Those two things are kind of the big things we're seeing right now on the enforcement side. It's really hard to predict what the next things are that are going to happen on the enforcement side, but there needs to be some changes that happen with regard to the exchanges, because some of those premium costs have really gone up a lot. And we've talked about this in earlier presentations. The change between 2016 and 2017 saw some jurisdictions, some places out there, Phoenix, Arizona, seeing 145% premium increase between 2016 and 2017. It's not like that everywhere, but there's an obvious, this chart and the next one show that there's just been a big sort of decrease, a big sort of pullback of insurers. And here in this one, you see more than 40% of all healthcare.gov counties have just one insurer. So, while I don't think this is a situation where the death spiral is happening now, and I think there's a sense of urgency that was created in the wake of the ACA to try to get the Republican lawmakers in the House to jump and do something and take action. It may not be as urgent as those speeches suggest, but there definitely are a lot of jurisdictions out there where there isn't much choice. So what are the big key takeaways? If you're a plan sponsor, if you're, what does all of this mean for you? If you're in the HR department of your company, if you're, on the payroll team, what do you need to do? What do you need to understand going forward? Well, I think obviously, from our perspective as your benefits consultants, the number one thing you need to do is continue to comply with the Affordable Care Act. It remains the law of the land. We saw earlier those penalties are still very, very high for 2017. And the IRS just updated its website saying, hey, look, these penalties are still out there. So even while there's discussions and deliberations and debate over the ACA, you still have to be doing all those things you were doing last year, including the hours tracking, the measurement periods, preparing to do your 1094C, your 1095Cs. Those things continue. Secondly, you want to watch the agencies closely. Understand how the ACA is going to be enforced. Your state small group rules may be changing because of the enforcement of the ACA by the agencies. The other thing to watch is the state innovation waivers. If your state gets a state innovation waiver, remember that's under the current law. That's under the ACA as it currently exists today. States could get those waivers, and your plan may have to be different than it is today. And the third thing is you want to make sure that you're still continuing to comply with the other non-ACA stuff. And we often forget about that in all of the excitement of the repeal and replace effort. We forget that there's probably more than 2/3 of the laws out there that you have to comply with are ERISA, HIPAA, GINA, ADA, EEOC regulations, wellness rules. There's so much out there for your health and welfare and insurance plans to comply with that it's well over 2/3 of what you need to do. And and make sure you're doing all those other things as well. We wanted to finish up today's presentation with just a kind of a big overview of kind of what are the big things that are happening that you kind of need to know about, that we've been discussing in our webinars and alerting to you through our e-alerts. One thing that happened recently, which was actually some DOL guidance came out very recently, but it really actually went back to January 13th was the date on the guidance, and that guidance clarified that an employer association's administrative services arrangement was not an ERISA welfare plan or a MEWA plan. And in that DOL guidance, they looked at a program that was very much geared toward employers, right? All of the things that were in that administrative services arrangement between a group of different large employers, they only were focused on the administrative services only. They were only focused on the operations of those large employers that were subject to that agreement, and they didn't actually boil down to individual employees in any way. So the DOL, looking at that, said it's not an ERISA welfare plan, and we don't think that this in any way can be a MEWA because this type of arrangement or program is not designed to pool risk among two or more employers, which is an essential part of a MEWA. It only provided administrative services, so that was an important clarification by the DOL. And then on January 20th, this is something we talked about last time, but it continues to boggle the minds of employers out there, so we wanted to bring it up again. The IRS issued unofficial guidance on the taxation of fixed indemnity plans in a CSR, and actually, in a CCAM, Chief Counsel Advice Memorandum. It was actually Chief Counsel Advice Memorandum number 2017-0313, and we had heard reports from some of our clients that there were insurance carriers advising clients that they do not need to comply with the CCAM because it's unofficial IRS guidance and only applies to a particular situation. Now, while that is technically true, that CCAMs only do apply to a specific situation and they're not the same as a regulation, they don't have that kind of same regulatory impact, it does shed light on and provide insight into the views of the IRS with respect to a particular situation. That those views of the IRS can later be put into a regulation, so we generally advise all of our clients to comply with CCAMs. This particular CCAM applied to employers sponsoring fixed indemnity health plans and certain types of wellness plans that operate like fixed indemnity health plans. And the CCAM states that that a fixed indemnity health plan that's employer paid or that's purchased by employees on a pre-tax basis through a cafeteria plan will result in taxable income equal to the amount of any benefits paid under the plan. And the IRS states in the CCAM that an employer cannot exclude from an employee's gross income payments from a fixed indemnity health plan that was paid for by the employer on a tax-free basis or purchased by an employee on a pre-tax basis. The reasoning is that when a fixed indemnity health plan is employer paid or purchased on a pre-tax basis, then the usual tax-free treatment of the benefits paid under Code Section 105 would not be available because the amount paid would not be a reimbursement of medical care under Code Section 213D. And so because the amount paid is not entitled to tax-free treatment, any amounts that are paid under that fixed indemnity health plan as reimbursements to that employee would be included in the employee's gross income and wages, and there really is no way to track that. There's no one out there that's calculating and running the accounting on those payouts from the fixed indemnity health plans. So, and at the end they also mentioned this applies to wellness plans that are sort of masquerading as wellness plans, but in reality are fixed indemnity health plans. So, our recommendation is if you can, change those from the pre-tax to the post-tax, and that's I think the best way to deal with that. We also saw on February 1st the Department of Health and Human Services OCR office announced a $3.2 million civil penalty against a covered entity based on noncompliance with HIPAA. And in that case, it was very interesting that the HHS said it was for noncompliance over many years with the HIPAA security rule. After there was an unencrypted, non-password protected device that was lost at an airport, and there was a theft of an unencrypted laptop computer. from a storage area on the business premises. So very bad penalty, $3.2 million. And then on March 8th, we saw a House committee approve a bill that eased employer requirements on genetic information disclosure. And there's a lot of sort of misunderstanding and concern by employees and employers out there about it because just I think a lot of misinformation. The bill at issue is the Preserving Employee Wellness Programs Act, H.R. 1313. It was introduced on March 2nd, and it exempts wellness plans from certain provisions of ADA and GINA that make it difficult to collect genetic information as part of the health risk assessment, so long as those wellness plans still comply with the limitations on rewards and incentives for participating in the program. So there was a lot of misinformation. I saw a lot of articles out there saying, oh, now your employer can require that you give them their genetic information. It's not like that. It just essentially is making it easier for employers to incorporate those elements into health risk assessments. And then on March 15th of 2017, we saw the IRS issue an information letter on cafeteria plan forfeitures. Really nothing that really changed existing law. It just clarified that you don't have to, if there's a cafeteria plan forfeiture, you don't have to pay that money over to the U.S. Treasury. So just sort of a clarification of existing law. On March 22nd, the House passed the Small Business Health Fairness Act, which made it easier for small businesses to get into these association health plans with less difficult regulatory requirements. Of course, still, just passed the House. It's not law yet, but we're watching that closely. Also, the House passed the Self-Insurance Protection Act on April 5th of 2017. That's a law that would, a bill that would basically make it easier for individuals to get self-insured health insurance coverage by making sure that the stop-loss policy on the self-insurance, the stop-loss policy would not be considered to be health insurance coverage for purposes of federal laws and regulations. That should make it easier for more companies to self-insure without all of the intervening federal regulation, which the sponsors call bureaucratic overreach. So interesting bill. We're continuing to watch that to see if that may become law. And there was a very big recently announced EEOC wellness plan settlement that was dated to April 5th, which indicated that this was a settlement of a big case, and we have attached the e-alert on it if you want some more information about it. But essentially, it was a case where an employer was requiring the employees to complete a very probing health risk assessment, and if they opted out, they'd have to pay for the full cost of the self-insured health insurance coverage, the full cost of the premium, and an employee said no. They objected. They filed suit. EEOC got involved. The EEOC got involved, filed suit. In the end, the settlement required the employer to pay $100,000 to the employee and required, among other things, workplace training by everyone at the company. So it's definitely very interesting. Definitely check out our e-alert, which is downloadable today. And then, of course, just on April 24th, very recently, HHS announced another large $2.5 million civil penalty and another violation of the HIPAA rules for a wireless health services provider. Also, a situation with an unencrypted laptop with lots of PHI on it. So you got to really be careful with those HIPAA rules. We would always recommend you come in and do a HIPAA training with our benefits consultants. It's just such an important thing today with these giant settlements that are coming out. It's just scary stuff. Okay, the last big compliance development for today is we're going to talk about the new leader of the Department of Labor. Well, he hasn't officially been confirmed yet. It's very likely that he will be confirmed because there is a lot of support for his confirmation. The big news here was that on February 16th, the former appointee by President Trump, Anthony Kuzder, stepped down, withdrew from consideration. It looked like it may have been due to some personal reasons, and President Trump appointed Alexander Acosta in his place. And the reason why this is so interesting for us and for our clients is quite frequently we get this question of, well, under the Trump administration, does that mean there's going to be a substantial decrease in the number of audits that are going to be out there of health and welfare plans? And while there's really never any way to be sure of the answer to that question, and we can't predict how administrative agencies will act, this appointee, Mr. Acosta, is likely to be much more pro-worker and protective of employee rights than the last one. While he is a Republican and a conservative, just based on his background, which you can see here, we really, in our view, we don't expect any major scale down of DOL audits under his rule. So that's the final development for today. As always, we continue to keep monitoring everything that's going on with the repeal and replace effort, and we will, definitely check out our ACA Now webpage that's regularly being updated, and come with any questions or any questions you have. We're here to answer them. We're here to help.
Great information, Dan. Thank you. SHRM PDC and HRCI credits can be downloaded now by clicking the yellow document icon to the right of the widget bar on the bottom of your screen. As you exit the webinar, please take a moment to complete the brief questionnaire that appears so we can address any feedback you have for us. Any further questions can be sent to ashley.whelan@corpsyn.com. That's ASHLEE.WHELAN@CORPSYN.com. Thanks for your attention, and please enjoy the rest of your day.